The waves slammed against the aging support beams of Pelican Point House as I watched the trail of sleek Audis and Teslas disappear beyond the dunes. My inheritance, this so-called forgotten shack, tucked on a windswept Oregon coast, groaned under the weight of the gathering storm, like it was mocking the family who left it behind. My name is Lena Morales, and at 32 I had just inherited what my family openly mocked as the biggest blunder in my late grandfather's estate. A fading, paint-peeled two-story beach house perched along a protected shoreline where developers had never laid a finger. Lena always had a thing for lost causes, my cousin Julia had scoffed, outside the probate office that morning. She'd strutted out clutching the deed to a gleaming Portland high-rise project, worth over $15 million, 0 cents. My older brother Caleb claimed the family's vineyard and wedding estate in Napa, $22 million, 0 cents, on paper at least. And me? I got the dusty old summer house where we used to roast marshmallows and chase gulls barefoot across the rocks. It's a patch of useless coast, my uncle had declared, voice dripping with condescension. No developer touches it. State regulations, environmental red tape, and now something about archaeological risk zones. Waste of paperwork. What none of them knew, and what I'd never bothered to correct, was that I'd spent the past 2 years working with the Coastal Heritage Institute. My focus? The underwater remnants of 19th century trading posts lost along the Pacific coasts, including one rumored to be right beneath this bluff. Lightning forked across the charcoal sky as I unlocked the warped front door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sea spray, cedar, and memory. Just as it had been when Grandpa Elias lived here. He'd insisted the house stay in the family. My parents had agreed, mostly because no one else wanted to foot the insurance bill. But he'd known, just like I had. The storm I'd been tracking for months, Storm Hadley, had just been upgraded to a Category 2, barreling straight toward the coast. To most, it was a threat. To me, it was a chance. I set my backpack down and flipped open the box I'd hidden behind a panel in the study. Inside, historical survey records, old coastal maps, and letters dating back to the 1860s. Traders, settlers, shipwreck reports. Most important of all, Grandpa's handwritten notes. Turns out the beach house wasn't just standing on forgotten land. It sat atop a buried port town swallowed by erosion and time, long before anyone thought to build glass towers or vineyards. And the storm surge? It would likely erode the last layer of sand covering what I'd been waiting to document for years. Just then, the screen door creaked open. "Still here, Dr. Morales?" came a familiar voice. I turned toward the porch. Tom Bennett, director of the Pacific Archaeological Conservancy, stood dripping under his raincoat, holding a thermos and a grin. Let's see if the storm gives us what the developers couldn't. The local handyman, Rick Dawson, had been helping me prep the house for the storm, though he didn't know the full truth behind why I stayed behind. Just locking down some documents, I called over the howling wind as he stepped onto the porch. "Everything secure?" "Far as it can be," he replied, brushing sand off his flannel sleeves. Brick had been around Pelican Point for decades. Fixed up my grandfather's roof, repaired the dock after a bad tide in '03, even helped rebuild the staircase after a landslide. "You sure you ain't evacuating?" he asked, casting a wary glance at the dark horizon. "That bluff's not gonna hold if this storm kicks up like they say." I nodded slowly. "I'm sure, Rick." I didn't mention the monitoring devices buried beneath the dunes, or the sonar equipment carefully positioned to measure shoreline shifts. Just like Grandpa, Rick had known my family long enough to sense when something was unsaid. "Your grandfather," Rick said quietly. "He used to stay through storms too, told me once. They had a way of stripping away lies, showing what was buried underneath." I glanced out the window. The waves had doubled in size, foam licked the base of the bluff. The dunes were thinning, faster than expected. At the university's coastal lab, I'd spent months analyzing sonar, erosion scans, and handwritten notes, and every single clue pointed here, to the quiet, unassuming stretch of coast where no one ever belt, Because this land wasn't just legally protected, it was historically sacred. Rick, I said, stepping into the study where old nautical charts were spread across my grandfather's desk. Ever wonder why Grandpa never sold this land? He nodded once. Plenty of times. I flipped open a weathered leather journal, the spine cracking. In 1854, a Spanish ship called the Nuestra Reina vanished along this coast, I began, pointing to the entry. She was hauling religious relics, colonial gold, and imperial documents back to Europe. Rick whistled low. That'd be quite the cargo. Every historian said she went down off the coast of California, but Grandpa's notes? They tell a different story. I showed him the sketch, an outline of the cove, the dunes, the underwater shelf just past the reef. Then I laid out the evidence. Fragments of tile, a bronze coin I found near the rocks, and ground-penetrating radar data from 2 weeks ago. Rick sat down slowly in my grandfather's old armchair, eyes scanning the pages. This whole time, your family thought this place was a rusting memory, and it's sitting on top of a shipwreck worth more than their entire portfolio. I nodded. They never read Grandpa's journals, never look deeper. My phone buzzed again, a message from Dr. Sarah Martinez, state archaeologist. Storm surge projection confirms maximum impact. We're on standby, ready when you are. I typed back, confirmed, we'll have full exposure by midnight. Rick stood up, his voice lower now. They don't know, do they? Your family? I shook my head. No, but they will. He chuckled, watching the storm swallow the last of the dunes. I guess the truth finally decided to come ashore. If you want to see what the storm uncovers, and what Lena's family does when the truth rises with the tide, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this unraveling legacy. I thought about their smug, laughing faces as they'd driven off in their luxury cars, so sure they'd walked away with the better end of the inheritance. My brother bragging about wine tours, my cousin raving about rooftop views. They were always chasing the next big thing, so dazzled by the future that they never once paused to look at what was already here. The wind howled louder now, sending one of my grandfather's old deck chairs tumbling across the porch. But beneath that roar, I could hear something else. The low, rhythmic pull of waves clawing at the base of the barrier bluff, gnawing away at 150 years of buried truth. You should head out, Rick, I said, sealing the last container of emergency supplies. It's going to be a long night. He hesitated in the doorway, hand on the knob. Your grandfather. He'd be proud, Lena. He always said you were the only one who saw this place for what it really was. I gave a faint smile. Let's hope I can prove him right. Once Rick disappeared into the storm, I stood alone on the porch. Rain pelted sideways under the overhang. The dunes were already thinning, just as the simulations had predicted. By sunrise, the storm would have peeled back centuries of sediment, revealing the hidden bones of the Pacific's forgotten history. They thought they'd tricked me, handed me a crumbling shack and washed their hands clean, but in doing so they gave me the key to one of the most significant archaeological finds the Oregon coast had ever seen. I thought of Grandpa Elias's final words to me, whispered in a hospital room, scented with salt water and memory. Sometimes, mija, the richest treasure is the one no one else sees. The sky turned black as the storm surged. I checked my satellite phone, still online. Emergency food, lights, gear all in order. But the most critical piece was already recording. The waterproof camera rig pointed directly at the eastern edge of the property where the bluff was eroding fastest. The storm's power escalated. By 12:07 a.m., 20-foot waves pummeled the bluff. From behind the storm-rated glass, I watched the coastline reshape in real time. Then, just as predicted, chunks of dune fell away, and something wooden, long buried and water-darkened, pushed into view. Ground team in position, Dr. Martinez's voice crackled over the satellite feed. First timber fragment surfacing. We have movement. My heart pounded. I checked the live camera feed. There it was. My hands trembled as I grabbed the secondary cam and began documenting. Confirming visual on galleon construction, I reported. Timber patterns consistent with Spanish colonial shipbuilding, mid-19th century. The bluff kept crumbling as the ocean pooled and revealed. Through the foam and sand, pieces of carved hull and anchor fragments emerged. Ghosts of the Nuestra Reina, untouched since 1854. Wave after wave did what no developer ever could, exposed the buried ship, intact, forgotten, and finally found. And as the storm raged on, I knew something else with absolute certainty. By tomorrow morning, my family would turn on their TVs or check their phones and discover they'd handed me a gold mine they were too blind to see. By dawn, as Storm Hadley pushed inland and the winds finally calmed, the full scope of what we had uncovered began to reveal itself. The Nuestra Reina hadn't just wrecked off Pelican Point. It had been perfectly preserved beneath the sand dunes that developers had deemed useless for decades. The galleon's hull, bulkheads, and, most remarkably, its sealed cargo hold had been protected from looters and erosion by layers of natural sediment. It was as if the land had been guarding her, for me, for this moment. My satellite phone buzzed nonstop as the first news choppers circled overhead. At first, it was just local stations. By late morning, the headlines were international. Sunken Spanish galleon discovered on Oregon coast. Storm exposes $40.00 M maritime treasure. Historic shipwreck found beneath protected dunes. I stood near the bluff with Dr. Martinez and the survey team, watching history rise from the waves as divers and technicians began their initial assessments. Then came the call I'd been expecting. My father's voice was tight, unfamiliar, uncertain. "We're, seeing something on the news," he said. "About that old house. There must be a mistake. Our surveys..." "We're focused on real estate," I replied coolly, like I was giving a guest lecture, "not historical preservation. We were looking for building potential, not..." "Whatever this is," he muttered. "Artifacts," I corrected. "Cultural history. And speaking of that, Dr. Martinez from the Oregon State Maritime Preservation Office would like a word about all those unapproved attempts to bulldoze a protected site." Silence. In the background, I heard Julia and Caleb snapping at each other over legal ownership. "We should meet," my father said at last. "As a family. Discuss options. Maybe come to an agreement." I watched a second team of surveyors arrive, their vehicles kicking up sand as they parked beside media vans. "I'm a little busy," I said, "but my lawyer can meet with you tomorrow. We've just finalized a preservation easement for the entire property." "A what?" "It means Pelican Point is now permanently protected. No development, ever. The land will be turned into a coastal research station and public maritime heritage center. Construction rights are off the table for good." I could almost hear his jaw clench. "Lena, be reasonable," he snapped. "Do you even understand what developers would pay for that land now?" "About $40 million, 0 cents less than what it's already worth to the world," I replied. "This was never about flipping land. This is about preserving truth." In the days that followed, Pelican Point transformed. What was once dismissed as a crumbling house on useless land became the most significant maritime archaeological discovery on the Pacific coast in over a century. The Nuestra Reina's cargo, gold coins, hand-carved religious relics, ceramics, and colonial documents, was carefully excavated, cataloged, and preserved. Research institutions offered partnership grants. Museums across the country reached out to negotiate exhibit loans. And through it all, I stayed grounded in the promise I'd made to Grandpa Elias, to protect this place, not just from storms and time, but from greed. My family tried everything to regain control. Legal maneuvers, teary phone calls, veiled threats through attorneys, and even a brief and laughable petition to have me declared mentally unfit to manage the property. But what none of them realized was that my grandfather, Elias Morales, had been smarter than all of us combined. His will was airtight. The transfer of Pelican Point House to me had been planned meticulously, and my documentation proving the site's archaeological value, rock solid. You could have been rich, Lena, my cousin Julia said bitterly when they finally dropped the last legal challenge. We stood on the newly reinforced overlook above the excavation site, watching researchers in wetsuits catalog pieces of the Nuestra Reina still emerging from the sand. I am rich, I replied, not turning to look at her. Just not in the way you mean. 1 year later, we opened the Pelican Point Coastal Archaeology Center. The old house, lovingly restored and expanded, now served as our research headquarters and public education facility. We rebuilt the eroded bluff and dune system using eco-engineering, preserving both the structure and the shipwreck beneath it. Rick Dawson, now semi-retired, joined our maintenance crew. He became the unofficial guide for new interns, teaching them not only how to secure storm shutters, but how to respect the land and its stories. One evening, as we watched the sunset from the rebuilt porch, he turned to me and said, "Your grandfather used to say that real wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you choose to protect." My family eventually adapted. The international spotlight from the discovery boosted interest in their other ventures. Julia rebranded her Portland condos with nautical themes. Caleb's Vineyard hosted a maritime memory event every summer. Even my father began attending our center's lectures, always quick to introduce himself as Dr. Morales' father. Last month I led a group of 5th graders through the main exhibit. A girl with bright eyes asked me, "Why didn't anyone find the ship before?" "Because," I said, kneeling beside her, "sometimes the most valuable things are buried where no one thinks to look. Those dunes developers ignored? They kept this history safe for over 150 years, just waiting for the right people and the right moment." Our newest exhibit showcases my grandfather's journals, displayed next to the sonar equipment that proved his long-dismissed theories. Visitors can flip through replicas of his notes, handwritten in ink faded by salt air, and see how a quiet man protected a legacy with foresight and love. In my office, formerly Grandpa's study, I keep one photo framed behind my desk. It's from the morning after Storm Hadley, the sun breaking over the horizon, golden light touching the newly exposed ribs of the Nuestra Reina. I'm standing alone on the shore, the old house behind me, still upright and defiant after all those years. My family thought they were punishing me, saddling me with an aging property and worthless land. In reality, they handed me the key to rewriting history. Now, when the skies darken and storms approach Pelican Point, I stand on that porch again, but never alone. Graduate students, visiting scientists, and volunteers gather beside me, all of us learning what Grandpa always knew. True value isn't always visible at first glance. Last week, I found a new message in the visitor log. It was signed in my father's distinctive script. I was wrong about what makes land valuable. Sometimes, the greatest worth lies in what we choose to preserve, not what we build. Beneath it, I added Grandpa's favorite line. The tides of time reveal all treasures to those patient enough to wait and wise enough to look beneath the surface. Pelican Point House still creaks in the wind. But it's not just a house anymore. It's a monument to patience, a lighthouse for curious minds, and proof that sometimes the best kind of revenge is building something that lasts. And every morning, when I unlock the doors to the center, I remember that night, the storm, the wreck, the secret revealed. They gave me dunes and weathered wood. I turned it into a legacy. If you've ever been told what you had wasn't worth anything, I'd love to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. And remember, sometimes life buries value where no one expects it. Trust your instincts. Protect what others overlook. That's where true legacy begins.